So, something to tell you guys before we get started. For those of you out there that would like to see reviews like this in an uncensored format, both Patreon and Subscribestar are available to you. In fact, if you get in at the $10 tier, you can actually suggest future reviews for me to do. So, if you haven't checked that out yet, please do so, or else you're going to just be seeing heavily censored versions of these reviews here on YouTube because, well, if I don't censor them, well, the monetization's out the window, and that's not good. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? You ever watch a show and then sit staring at the screen after the credits are done rolling and say to yourself, what in the actual hell did I just watch? Well, that's basically how I feel about Genocyber. Now, before I start getting into the skinny of what exactly this is, thing is, I feel that the rest of this review needs to be prefaced with something. I get a kick out of this era of anime, which is why this is the start of a new series called Messed Up Anime. Thing is, I'm an old man. I say that as a 37-year-old. Anyone older than me is probably going to want to hit me, but I feel older. You know, it is what it is. Anytime that I talk about anime, some of the stuff that I bring up, I see younger anime fans' eyes start to spin because they've never heard of half the crap I talk about. But anyway, I grew up in this forgotten era called the 1990s. And then my teenage years were in the early 2000s. It was a weird time. In fact, it was around a time that we would call the animation age ghetto. It was around that time that anime was just starting to gain momentum here in the West, specifically thanks to Toonami. It was that very show block that got me into Gundam with Gundam Wing, but even after watching the 2-hour block of programming anytime I got home from school, I was left hungry for more. That was especially true in the early 2000s, as shows like Bleach, Inuyasha, and Gundam Seed were taking over Adult Swim, which was like being subjected to a bunch of shows that were just mid as fuck. Except for Gundam Seed. Gundam Seed is fucking terrible, and no one should watch it. Ever. No, I'm not stopping! Anyway, this is where I found myself going to a video rental place a couple of towns over, where they had an adult animation section. And no, you fucking coomers, that wasn't a hentai section. It meant animation that was not aimed at children. Stuff that I found in that section was hyper-violent, so much that if a Disney parent ever rented it on accident, they'd get a goddamn heart attack if they saw it. That's where I saw stuff like Spawn the Animated Series for the first time, which obviously isn't an anime, but that's where I found it. Stuff like Twilight of the Dark Master, Biohunter, Ninja Scroll, the Devilman OVAs, and then of course the subject of today's video, Genocyber. Now, Genocyber is an interesting beast, largely because its manga and its anime are so wildly different from one another. The manga was created by Tony Takazaki, who prior to Genocyber had done the manga for AD Police Files, which is a bubblegum crisis prequel. After Genocyber, he became more known for parody manga that he did of both Gundam and Evangelion. The Genocyber manga is about two fraternal twin sisters, one of whom has a substantial psychic power that's being tested by an evil corporation to use as a weapon because what else are you going to do in a cyberpunk setting? Though in a sense, this was one of the shows, along with Biohunter and Guyver, that started to establish the biopunk genre. And if Genocyber is notable for any one thing, it's that. As you can imagine, all of the plans go tits up, and then the manga just kind of ends. Now, why does it end, you might ask? Because it sadly got cancelled. Which, again, unfortunate, because even though the writing was, at the start, kind of middle of the road, the imagery was really cool. I like the art style, and it did actually have potential as sort of a 90s anti-hero psychic RoboCop type of story, which sounds awesome. Somebody should do that. Now, the anime, which is what I'm going to largely be talking about from here on in, was written and directed by Koichi Ohara, who before this had largely done mechanical design on shows like Video Warrior Laserion, Ninja Robots, and Gunbuster, though he wasn't the main guy on any of those. Then, seemingly out of nowhere in his career, he gets his hands on Genocyber and decides to make an OVA series out of it. Thus, we have what we're going to talk about today, which is probably one of the edgiest series to ever have existed, at least from what I have seen. So Genocyber is a story about two sisters that have psychic abilities. And that's about where the similarities end to the original manga, to be honest with you. Anyway, now one of them is a cyborg because her body sucks, and the other one is a mute. A mad scientist essentially wants to merge the powers and consciousnesses of both sisters to create a psychic being with incredible power. To what end, you ask? Well, I have no fucking clue. You'd have to either be just stupidly evil or stupidly stupid to want to do that. Though I lean more towards stupidly evil in that one, because when a detective begins investigating the mysterious circumstances behind the sisters' father being killed and how this mad scientist has ties to the whole thing, while Elaine is in the hospital, Elaine being the other one that he wants to merge the other sister with, this mad scientist has a bunch of assassins with masks and science coats brutally murder an entire fucking hospital. On top of that, he vivisects the detective and lets him wake up to see the results before he fucking dies of blood loss. Jesus. Okay, let's back up a second. So, you got all these forces, right, that are capable of killing an entire hospital's worth of people without raising any suspicion or alarm. Why not just sneak in, abscond with your target, and then sneak out? That would honestly be the smarter plot point. Plus, it keeps an interesting conflict between the law enforcement officer and the company that just wants to do this. Instead, the writer and the director go for the ridiculously gory option, and even though I am a gore hound, I still think this is a little excessive, though the head falling off sequence is scarily well animated. But then he bores us later on with this long-ass diatribe / explanation about how all this shit is supposed to work with the psychic powers and the whatnot that completely wrecks the momentum of the story! Okay, time for a rant. By the way, we're going to number these rants I have because there's going to be at least 3 of them. Rant number 1. This is the general problem with being edgy. It doesn't make for good storytelling. Of the comic books I've written, yes, this is a completely shameless self-promotion, the one that everyone seems to have praised pretty universally is 3 Nights, 4 Days, because my team and I worked very hard on it, and we appreciate you guys showing us all that love. Anyway, I wrote that book intending it to be a gory mess. I mean, there's a page where a demon's brains are literally leaking out the side of its dismembered head. The thing is, that blood has a purpose to it. I won't spoil it because I would like for you guys to back the book on Indiegogo if you haven't gotten a copy of the first book yet, plus you can grab the sequel too. But admittedly, pulling off the whole idea of carnage with a purpose is something that I learned from observing masters of it, like Go Nagai and Kentaro Miura. While Genocyber's violence is incredibly well animated, to the point where I can't help but admire it, it often happens without a point. Contrast that to Devilman or Berserk, where the violence is always communicating something that moves the story forward and builds the world up. This just, well, doesn't. By the way, this is a prime example of the dark versus edgy comparison. Devilman is a dark story. Berserk is a dark story. Genocyber is an edgy story. If you're going to do anything, do the former, not the latter. Okay, rant over. After a lengthy explanation about the plot to a couple of random cyborgs that seem to show up to enforce the will of another shady organization, because I guess you can't have enough when it comes to this genre, everything goes tits up and the scientist gets what he wanted. The psyches of both of the sisters merge to create a new being called the Genocyber, which is where, of course, we get the title of the manga and the anime. Then, the creature lays waste to the facility, kills a bunch of people, and then eviscerates the sociopathic cyborgs for basically getting in its way. Then, Elaine finds the dead body of a friend of hers from the beginning of the story, and because of that, she blows up all of Hong Kong, because of course she does. Goes without saying that the first OVA is a stinker. It's a well-animated stinker, but a stinker. The second story in the Genocyber anime saga is called Global War, and of the 3, in my opinion, it's the best. Now, in this particular part of the saga, a nation called Peregrine has withdrawn from the United Nations because it doesn't want to be part of a single world government, which I can understand. However, these idiots immediately try to invade another country, which causes the United States to respond. By the way, that's actually a good setup. Reason being is that if you consider one of the ways, according to United Nations bylaws, to lose your sovereignty, one of them is to invade another nation. If you do so, you open yourself up to military response. That, of course, is the premise behind Operation Desert Storm, and then, of course, was one of the justifications that was used in regards to involving the nation of Iraq in the War on Terror. By the way, I'm not getting political on this, I'm just saying that's sort of the similar premise that's being used in this. Now, granted, nations don't always lose their sovereignty when it happens to this sort of thing. Sorry. Anyway, things don't really go well because a few Karain attack helicopters do their best Schutzstaffel impersonation and commit some war crimes on a bunch of fucking kids. They chew the tykes to pieces in what can best be described as a pretty accurate showing of what happens when high-caliber weaponry hits a human body. This is going to sound weird, and since we're censoring this for YouTube, you're not going to be seeing this if you're not a patron of mine. But this is essentially one of the most gorgeously animated child murder scenes I've ever seen. That is not a bunch of words I thought I would ever say together in one sentence, but there it is. Anyway, Elaine isn't too happy that these trigger-happy idiots just murdered her new friends, so she turns into the Genocyber and murders them back, justifiably so. Well, with the scales in balance, she flies off. Thing is, the US forces don't know what the hell to do about something like that, so they get in touch with the Kiryu group from the first episode. The same group that murdered a hospital full of innocent people just to get their hands on Elaine, though I don't think they know that. Though the US forces find Elaine unconscious and take her in, they have no idea that they've essentially brought a wolf on board, and then there's another wolf on board that's being brought with the Kiryu group that's going to want to fight for the territory, and everybody else is just a bunch of lambs. We're also introduced to Myra, who is reminded of her dead daughter who was killed on the plane that the cyber psychos shot down in the first OVA. Speaking of cybernetics, Elaine is largely cybernetic now. Now, why, you ask? Well, this is the director's attitude towards you asking a question about this plot. From here, we're introduced to the Varagenoid, which sounds like a sex robot modeled after 2B from Nier Automata would likely be called after such things are invented, and Yoko Taro realizes he can make some significant bank off of such a concept. Not that I would purchase a duplicate of 2B and her big ass and turn her into a robotic wife that cooks, cleans, and I can bang like a snare drum. Anyway, the Varagenoid robot gets into conflict with Elaine at that point, and loses the fight pretty significantly, even though it managed to corrupt the Genocyber's arm. At that point, the US forces are rightfully pissed off, considering they lost good soldiers over a situation that the Varagenoid's creator isn't really forthcoming about. All in all, that's the long and short of the Global War OVA, or at least part 1 of it, which, again, I would say is not bad. In fact, I like it quite a bit. It's not the greatest thing ever, but it's not bad at all. Now, the episode after this is called Varagenoid Attack, and it might have some of the coolest kills and most well-animated body horror I've ever seen in an anime, but Jesus fuck does the story blow. Which leads me to rant number 2. I will freely admit that the second hardest part of storytelling, and being good at it, is characterization. The hardest ever is engaging dialogue, which is why people who are so good at it are so celebrated. But anyway, characterization, as I mentioned, the second hardest thing, is tough for 2 reasons. The first is that you have to have an innate knowledge of how people work. Specifically, you have to be able to put yourself into someone else's shoes entirely to figure out how they would react to the situation that you've put them in. That's combined with the other tough element, which is essentially creating an entirely separate human being from yourself in your own mind, down to character traits, character faults, and so forth. Then you have to keep doing it over and over again. If you can't, you have no future as a writer. If it's something you struggle with, ultimately the characters you create are going to be hackneyed, corny, or just stupid. It goes without saying that Koichi Ohara struggles with characterization more than someone without much fiber in their diet struggles to take a dump. The characters in these OVAs are fucking awful. The only ones who act like humans are the military personnel, and they're not even hard to write because they're just standard rational people. Everyone else, like the mad scientist and even Myra at the end, act unhinged for the sake of acting unhinged. It comes across as just dime a dozen crazy person talk that you see recycled in anime over and over again throughout the years, and ultimately is one of the weirder trends of the medium. Contrast this to John Carpenter's The Thing, where those characters are well fleshed out and realized, and are acting in a way that you'd expect them to do whenever they're faced with something otherworldly and horrifying. That, my friends, is good characterization. Go watch The Thing, it's amazing. Genocyber just fucking fails at it. Anyway, the Varagenoid infected hand becomes its own creature and kills the ever-loving fuck out of the crew. As I mentioned earlier, the animation here is fucking amazing. I didn't think a spine rip could be called beautiful, let alone doing a spine rip by starting from digging into someone's fucking face. Somewhere, Sub-Zero from Mortal Kombat is sitting in his chair at the Lin Kuei Temple taking notes down to the last detail. Thing is, the ending sequence is pretty straightforward. The creature takes over the rest of the ship and basically assimilates all of the human beings on board. The Mad Doctor is killed in an honestly pretty awesome way by having his brain come out of his face and then gets exploded by Elaine's psychic powers. It's fucking cool. And this is after he gets hit with an axe, by the way. It's so good. I love that kill. But anyway, Myra goes batshit insane and starts saying Elaine is a god or something because the writing in the show is honestly shit. Either way, Elaine kills the remnants of the Varagenoid and thus wins the day. Like I mentioned earlier, of the 3 arcs, this one is probably my favorite, but that's not saying much because the characterization is ass. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm a gore hound. More than anything, I think the action in this is pretty good as well. And of course, I already praised the body horror. I feel like if the writer actually knew a thing about characterization, this could have been an all-around good watch. But, well, hindsight is 20/20, I suppose. Now, on to the 3rd arc, which I would argue is probably the weirdest. So the whole thing starts with a bunch of attacks from the Kuryu group on Genocyber that really don't go anywhere. And the head of the Kuryu group is saying he's going to do everything he can to kill it, etc. Standard bad guy speech, right? Well, apparently there was a massive world war to try and kill this character that honestly just wanted to be left the fuck alone, and now the entire Earth is fucked so that the story can have a post-apocalyptic setup. Nice job, guys. GG. Alright. 3rd and final rant of the video. Probably one of my favorite videos I've ever done is called The Idiot Plot Done Right, when I talked about Mobile Suit Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans. In fact, that was the frame that I used for the review. And by the way, it's a great show. The thing is, sometimes you can create an interesting story because someone screwed up and did something stupid. The thing is, there needs to be some sort of a character flaw, an established one, that causes this to happen. In the case of Iron-Blooded Orphans, the failures of Tekkadan came about because of Orga's foolishness, naivete, and then McGillis Farid's combination of zealotry and assuming people gave a fuck about the Gundam Bale. It was 2 young people doing stupid things that get young people killed in military conflicts. Now, Genocyber's 3rd part is an idiot plot in the sense that the post-apocalypse comes from everyone being a fucking moron and not being an established character in the first place. Literally everybody that decides to blow up the goddamn planet just shows up at the beginning of this. Not to mention, the logic is just stupid. Hey, here's this big psychic creature with ridiculous power that just wants to be left alone. What do? Do we A, leave it the fuck alone, B, leave it the fuck alone, or C, try to kill it? Obviously the stupid option is C. Because the only reason anybody's been slaughtered by this goddamn thing at this point is just because you don't leave it alone. I mean, for fuck's sake, she's literally just a mute kid aside from the massive psychic powers. If you left her alone, she'd probably just find a family to stay with and try to live happily ever after, which is what she was doing in that one country. Instead, this dipshit blows up the planet to try and kill the unkillable, and then it all gets fucked up, and then the 3rd part starts off as being pants on head retarded. Thing is, this is barely a Genocyber story after that. We completely switch gears to a place that seems like either a boring version of Mega City 1 from Judge Dredd, or a more interesting version of City 17 from Half-Life 2, depending on your perspective. We switch to a couple of lovers named Ryu and Mel, and Mel is blind. The goal is to come to the city and get enough money to cure her blindness. Well, Ryu is apparently a good knife thrower, and Mel is a psychic, so they start to basically do parlor tricks to raise money. Now, how do I know she's psychic? Because it's obvious. She can tell what you look like with no vision. Of course she's a psychic. Now, how is she a psychic, you ask? Well, here's a wrench. As for the city itself, it's run by an evil, corrupt mayor who likes to kill people because of course it is. There's also a lower class of people that seem to be getting preached to by what seems to be some sort of a Christian minister, though that ends up not really being the case. Spoiler alert, it's basically they think Genocyber is God. And the mayor in this moment is euphoric, not because any phony god's blessing, but because he's a total D-bag, and thus tells his right-hand man to go kill more people. Meanwhile, Ryu gets set up in some knife-throwing tricks that ends up with him killing someone when he obviously didn't want to. Now, you might ask yourself, why is he getting set up by this party of rich people to kill a guy? Well, here's a wrench. Anyway, Ryu and Mel run away from the city guards and try to hide in the ruins under the city. And there they find a fossilized Genocyber because now the show has realized what's in the fucking title. The final OVA that follows this up is honestly boring as fuck until the very end. Like I mentioned, Mel's a psychic, and this lets Genocyber resurrect her for some reason, even though we don't know why the fuck Elaine was even dead to begin with. The long and short is that Mel merges with Elaine, making an even bigger Genocyber that blows up the city because there needs to be some sort of a resolution. Then they unmerge. The Genocyber then goes to the big space station in the sky that the evil corporation set up, blows it up, and then I guess reincarnates itself as a child so that Mel and Ryu can raise her or something. I don't know. It's fucking stupid, and I honestly was glad the instant that it ended, which is why I'm rushing through this third part. Look, Genocyber honestly is a turd. It's a really, really, really well-animated turd, but it's a turd nonetheless. As cool as the blood and guts are, which, again, some of the best-looking blood and guts effects I've ever seen in an anime ever, and I don't know if anything tops it in that regard, there's nothing to tie it together. It just does it to kind of do it. Yeah, maybe it's weird for a gore hound like me to say this, but I kind of need a reason for there to be so much blood and guts. For example, it kind of makes sense for a game like, let's say, Doom Eternal to be gory, because the Doom guy hates demons, and he wants them to die in the worst way. So he makes that happen. And then you've got a manga like Devilman. In that case, it makes sense for there to be blood and gore, because you're dealing with demons who think human beings are expendable or playthings or nothing more than a meal. As such, they're going to butcher people in the worst way. The same could be said of Berserk, and thus the fights are going to be animalistic. Genocyber's gore in a lot of points just kind of seems to be there. This is what I mean about a show being edgy, and why I honestly think that being edgy is just signs of a lack of talent. You've got to be communicating something with violence, or else it's just violence for its own sake. The same honestly applies with nudity as well, which is relevant for what I'm about to say about the director here in a second. Nudity in the arts for its own sake honestly just comes across as an excuse to have it rather than communicating something artistically. I understand that some people enjoy these things, but I am definitely not one of them. Now you might be wondering what happened to the director and writer Koichi Ohara. Well, he went on to direct the sequel to the edgy as fuck MD Geist, which, by the way, I will definitely review as part of this series, and then went on to work on the edgy titty anime Ikitosen, and then recently worked on the edgy and retarded show redo of Healer. I didn't think you could make a career out of creating things that are edgy and retarded, but there you go. He managed to do it. Congratulations. You still suck. What doesn't suck are comic books, specifically mine. So, if you have not already, if my book, 3 Nights, 4 Days, Part 2 sounds interesting, please go back it on Indiegogo if you have not done so already. Also, get on the mailing list for The Saint and Peregrine Dark Knight in the Windy City. It is a big crossover from a couple of flagship characters of two brand spanking new comic book universes, relatively speaking, and it's going to be an awesome book. And then, of course, my novella, American Monsters, The Genesis of Project Lazarus, also available on Indiegogo if you're a fan of books like The Call of Cthulhu or At the Mountains of Madness. With a sci-fi twist, you're going to love it. On that note, guys, I appreciate everybody for watching. Next time around, I'll have another screwed up anime for us to look at together. But until that time, my name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla, and I will see you next time.